Nigeria. At least 13 people have lost their lives in a clash between protesters and security forces over the high cost of living and the country's general economic crisis. More than 300 protesters have been arrested. 24-hour curfews imposed in 4 northern states following reports of looting of government and public properties. Our next report telling you more.
The demonstrations against government policies, which have driven inflation to near a 3-decade high, began mobilizing on social media about a month ago. Organizers called for 10 days of protests from August 1st to 10th. Despite government efforts to halt the protests through court orders, security warnings and appeals from traditional and religious leaders, the protests gained momentum. By Thursday, people across the country had taken to the streets. Nigerians across major cities could be seen chanting, "We are hungry," wrapped in Nigeria's green and white flag, carrying placards that displayed their demands. The protests focused on pressing issues such as food shortages and alleged bad governance in the country. As per reports, public officials in the country are among the best paid in the continent. In contrast, Nigeria has some of the world's poorest and hungriest people, despite being one of the continent's top oil producers. Nearly 40% of its over 200 million people live in extreme poverty. The protests soon turned violent, and clashes between protesters and security forces ensued. In Kano, the country's second-largest city, protesters allegedly set the gatehouse of the Nigerian Communications Commission on fire. The police responded with tear gas to disperse the protesters. Reports of similar incidents came from major Nigerian cities, including the capital, Abuja. According to Nigerian police, the protesters damaged police stations and government infrastructure, made attempts to take over government houses, and looted warehouses and shops. On the other hand, rights groups alleged that the security forces were directly responsible for the deaths of 13 peaceful protesters. Amnesty International has condemned what it called the violent crackdown on peaceful protesters, calling it unjustified and unacceptable, and demanded an investigation into the killings. The Nigerian government, meanwhile, has urged protesters to allow some time for the economic reforms to take hold, and called on them to end their protests. The recent events in Nigeria are a reminder of the mid-June protests in Kenya, when hundreds of people stormed the parliament, forcing the government to abandon measures aimed at raising over $2 billion needed to address the nation's budget shortfall. The Kenyan protests resulted in at least 61 deaths. Nigeria has had a history of deadly protests. In 2020, rallies against police brutality resulted in at least 56 deaths. The unfolding situation in Nigeria is a stark reminder of the challenges faced by many African nations struggling with economic instability, political unrest, and social inequality. The outcome of these protests could set a precedent for how future dissent is handled, not only in Nigeria, but across the continent.
To stay up to speed with the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.